Stuart here with another exciting episode of Backing Services from the 12 Factor Collection. So today we're going to talk about backing services briefly, and you can read all of the 12 Factor factors on 12factor.net. Here is an idealized view of you and your environment. It could be a cloud. Could be your data center if you're running something like OpenStack or VMware. Really doesn't matter, because from a 12-factor point of view, we really want to wrap things up very tightly. And so one of the things we want to do more than anything is for applications, that's that purple box in the center, Kubernetes, FAS, PaaS, IaaS, etc., places where applications run. We really want those applications to connect to the things they need, which are in the backing services box to the left, to be able to get them. And as we spoke about in our configuration video, the way to do that is for the applications on startup to go get their configuration, and that configuration includes where the backing services are for that environment. So typically the way that's done, and we'll talk about it more in the next video, is that during the deployment process, an environment variable or other data configuration item is injected into the application host that the application can read on startup that answers the question, where is my configuration? Typically, we also inject some information during provisioning about the nature of the host itself, the host name, and what cluster it's in, what data center it's in, etc. Those are useful metadata things for monitoring, logging, and awareness. And the configuration for that is typically injected into the application host when it is provisioned. On deployment of our application, we inject the environment variables required to find our configuration and secrets. Those are then read, and our applications can use that information to find their backing services. And for the purposes of talking about 12-factor and backing services, we really don't care what they are or where they are. So they could be a database in your data center. They could be some cloud storage. They could be a third-party application like Google Maps that's out in the universe. It could be anything, but fundamentally, we treat them all as backing services, e.g., when your application starts, you expect them to be there. And there should be a certain amount of resiliency about that. And we'll talk about that more in other videos. But essentially, the deployment sequence that we expect is that before we deploy our app, that our backing services are up, configured, and cooking. The other thing to point out, and again, we'll revisit this in our next 12-factor video, is that we're going to keep all of the information we need about how to do all of this in source control. So we have our infrastructure as code that is going to tell us how to deploy and configure the infrastructure. We have our application code, which we're going to build once, put into our packaging, and store and deploy many times. And lastly, we have, of course, the builds and jobs that actually do all the mechanical work. In other words, we ideally want to automate all of this process. And so we want a repository that we can store disk images in for our infrastructure as a service components. We want a container registry if we're using containers like Kubernetes. And of course, we always want a package repository, which is where our ready-to-deploy code goes. And all of this is managed by some sort of engine that does builds, releases, infrastructure as code, whatever. And it may be one engine, it's certainly possible to do, or one engine that maybe coordinates the work of other engines. For example, we might use Jenkins to kick off an Ansible tower to do the provisioning of our infrastructure, but the actual CI and CD builds might happen in the build engine itself. We might use Azure DevOps, which has lots of different features. We might use the add-ons to GitHub. It doesn't really matter, but the central idea is that we have one or more engines that are capable of building out our infrastructure, configuring our backing services, and sometimes that means provisioning them as well. And that all of those things are going to be done once and reused through a repository, and that the basis for doing that is in our source controller. A notable exception to that is that our build engine may need to interact with our configuration and service engines so that our various secrets can be safe. So the overall flow is you configure builds and jobs. Typically, you start out with a CI build just to get your code building. And then in parallel, typically you have a little team working on your infrastructure as code. And then the DevOps team will do the deployment jobs. You may have various maintenance jobs, database maintenance. You may have jobs that do imports and exports, whatever. You're going to get all those set up over the course of your project. You're going to provision your infrastructure using your infrastructure as code engine. You're going to configure the backing services, and sometimes that is done as part of the provisioning, and sometimes it is the output of the provisioning. In other words, we're going to take, for example, we ask for a SQL server, and now we need to store the secret for the connection string to that SQL server in different roles into, say, our HashiCorp Vault, etc. We're going to, as part of the provisioning, right, we're going to set up the hosts. And as part of the continuous deployment build, typically when we're setting up the host, we're also pushing environment variables, or we may be creating additional instances if we're doing a blue, green, or rolling deployment or what have you. And then during that, we're going to be pushing that configuration, principally, where do I go to get my configuration info, plus whatever other custom information we need to bootstrap the applications when they start. We deploy the applications, we start them running, they pick up and benefit from all the things we've done previously. And at that point, our system is ready to be monitored and managed. So, backend services in a nutshell. Thank you for your kind attention.